Okay, so this is Unit 1, Area of Study 2, Part 2, and we're going to look in this presentation at the benefits and the non-benefits, look for a better word, of Nazis in power and life under the Nazi regime. So when the Nazis took power in 1933, you might remember the unemployment rate was 6 million people, and that was 30% of Germany. The Nazis wanted to mobilise Germany's workforce to work on mass public projects, government-funded projects with business like the Autobahn. They wanted to rearm Germany and invested heavily in industry, and they wanted to eliminate unemployment in Germany. So the policies that they had were the Labour Service Corps, where men served for 6 months, compulsory military service for between the ages of 18 to 25. They had the Autobahn program where they built 7,000 kilometres of motorways, which, is not a bad thing. They wanted to rearm Germany, and this was in direct contravention of the Treaty of Versailles. So the Allies were a little bit concerned that Germany was spending this much money on rearmament when it was outlawed in the Treaty of Versailles, but they didn't want to pick a fight with Hitler or Germany because they were still recovering from World War I. So in 1933, the Nazi Party spent 3.5 billion marks on tanks and weapons and uniforms, but by 1939, they spent 26 billion marks. And I'm sorry, but if you think they're not going to go to war by spending that much money on tanks and weapons and uniforms, then maybe you should not be in power. I can't judge because it's history. They had the Strength Through Joy program where they gave workers holidays and, not movie tickets, but opera tickets, theatre tickets for hard work. And they had the Beauty of Work program where they'd install swimming pools and canteens in workplaces. So these all sound like amazing things and benefits for the Aryan people of Germany. However, they all had their downsides. There was lack of freedom for workers. The cost of living skyrocketed in Germany, and the hours of work would actually increase. So you may have been working a 40-hour week, you are now working a 48-hour week. The Labour Service Corps was not all fun and games. These guys would get up at 3:30, they'd sing songs, they'd do gymnastics, they'd, spend hours polishing boots, and they'd go to bed at 10:30, they were starving, it was not fun. The Autobahn program, maybe that was a good thing, but rearmament, that's hard work and, clearly they're gearing up for a war. Strength Through Joy, not many people could afford the holiday or leisure schemes and they couldn't afford the time, and not many workplaces got a swimming pool or beautification. So if we look at the unemployment figures, we have to say that they were actually pretty impressive. So in 1933, when Hitler came to power, it was just around about 6 million people that were unemployed. But in 1939, the unemployment figure was at 302,000. Now, as you know, I'm no mathematician, but that's pretty impressive. However, again, with Hitler, there comes a bit of a clause, and that's that not included in these unemployment figures were Jewish people, unmarried men under the age of 25, women who gave up work or who were forced to quit work to get married, and, of course, don't forget those people who were being held in concentration camps. So we're going to look at some facets of Nazi life now under Nazi regime. So firstly, the one is religion. And on one hand, the Nazis' ideology opposed Christianity. If you think about Christian values, it's, love thy neighbour, treat others as you would treat yourself, love one another. Now, the Nazis don't subscribe to any of those things. So they were in direct conflict with Christian values. They started their own church and not so sure how that went, but yeah, they tried to steer people away from Christian values in order to gain support. But the Pope quite a few times with his Catholic Church spoke out against Hitler. Hitler didn't pick a fight with the Pope and vice versa, but it was sort of a live and let live kind of affair. When we look at gender roles and sexuality, Hitler despised homosexuals, as we've spoken about already previously. And so anyone who was overtly homosexual was rounded up by the Gestapo or by the SS and placed in a concentration camp. I mean, you've got to feel sorry for the women, because women in the 1920s in Germany, Berlin, Berlin was the party place of the world. There was cabaret, there was music, there was debauchery. Women spent a lot of time, fixing their hair and their makeup, and their outfits were outrageous. But of course, Hitler, being the killjoy that he is, didn't want women to even enjoy themselves for 1 second. So he didn't want them to spend any time on their appearance, but basically have really good childbearing hips and have lots and lots of babies for the Führer. So the typical woman in Germany was a German maiden who would wear a sort of an apron outfit and no makeup and very, very plain. Here we have I'm going to play my favourite musical here, which is Cabaret, and I encourage everyone to watch it. I can't. There we go. Celebrating right this way, your tables wait. Sorry, it's my favourite musical. So here we have, favourite musical. But yes, we have some women who really represent 1920s Germany. That sort of free spirit. Smoking, drinking, makeup, really, honestly, they could be living in this era and they would be idolised. But then we have the opposite, and this was the Nazi ideal, the long skirt, the traditional Bavarian woman with the big childbearing hips. I mean, they look like some, the Seekers from the 70s. So this was a hardship for women, and a lot of women had a lot of difficulty with this because their freedoms were taken away from that, and not just, physically, but also politically, because they were told to show no interest in politics and just to be happy homemakers. Then we come to education, and I've always said that if you want to change a society, you need to indoctrinate the youngest of children. If you think back to when you were in primary school, teacher, and maybe you had Miss Smith or Mr. Smith, you would go home at the age of 5 or 6 or 7 and say, Mr. Smith said or Mrs. Smith said, but you would believe everything that they said because they were your teacher. Now, I know in year 11 you absolutely believe everything your teacher says, note of sarcasm, but at that young age they believe in authority figures. So the Nazis wanted to change the ideology, so they really targeted the younger generations in indoctrinating them into their ideology. So there was a massive military focus for boys, and for women or girls, it was about homemaking and needlework. So teachers had to swear an oath to Hitler and join the Nazi Teachers League. Textbooks were rewritten to fit the Nazi view of history and also racial purity. Curriculum was changed to focus on physical education. Boys had to focus on military studies. Girls had to focus on needlework and home studies, and race studies were introduced. So if you were a Jewish person in a classroom in 1933 or 34 or 35, you were brought out the front of the classroom and the teacher would measure your nose, measure your skull, and there would be a chart there to say, we know you're Jewish because you have these measurements. And then the lessons began and ended in Heil Hitler. The history lessons focused on the evils of communism, and the geography lessons focused on the surrounding neighbours and how they had been so harsh on Germany during World War I. Here we have a rogues gallery, or a who's who of the Nazi Party at the time. Some lovely looking personalities. They're all smiling. I mean, how could you not be endeared to these people? So on the top left we have Heinrich Himmler, who was the head of the SS. In the middle at the top we have poor Ernst, and I have a soft spot for Ernst. He was the leader of the SA. Joseph Goebbels, top right, lovely looking man, very enthusiastic. He was basically Hitler's right-hand man, and he was the Minister for Propaganda. Then the bottom right we have Reinhard Heydrich, who was the head of the Gestapo. Middle we have Rudolf Hess, who was the head of concentration camps, and he was really behind the driving force to install the death camps in 1939 to 1945. And then bottom right we have our old mate Adolf Hitler, the Führer. So I'm going to stop it there, and the next part will go on to the persecution of the German Jews.